Hello, my name is Daren Redfearn. I'm with Nebraska Extension as a forage and crop residue management specialist. I'm in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. The topic of my presentation today will be forage and livestock options and cover crops following hail-damaged corn and soybean. A disclaimer before we begin is that this presentation was developed following a hail event in corn that was at approximately the VT or the stage of growth as it was just beginning to tassel, and then also the soybean was just beginning to flower or was in an R1 stage. Some of the issues of interest that we'll be talking with you today a little bit are the resources that are available. We really don't have any prescriptions or recipes that we can point to as something to do following a hail event. Most often, though, a lot of the recommendations that we make are for basic agronomic principles. So a lot of the things that we recommend, we already know the answer to. Also talk a little bit about some of the forage options. Planting date is probably the most important thing to consider as we look at choosing a forage crop. And then also we'll talk just a little bit about some of the comparisons between warm season and cool season options. And again, this is going to be related primarily to the planting date. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some recommended grazing strategies. The key points before we begin, though, is following any hail event, it's important that you communicate with your crop insurance agent. The second thing that you need to do if you're considering planting cover crops, especially for forage production, is that you need to know your previous herbicide program, because that may dictate some of the options that you have. Only then can you begin to determine what your ultimate goals are for selecting a cover crop, and then finally you can use this information to narrow down your choices so that you can better choose your appropriate cover crop. The primary purpose of selecting a cover crop ultimately is to provide cover. If you're looking at some forage or grazing, that should be viewed as a bonus. As a forage yield or forage biomass is important. Forage quality from a livestock standpoint is also important. And then if we're grazing, the capability of that plant to regrow is also a consideration. That's not to mean that forage is the only option. There are also other ecosystem services that can be provided, especially following a lot of the hail events. One of the things that we're interested in is reducing leached nitrogen, so the nutrient cycling aspect is also important. When you choose your cover crop, oftentimes there's an opportunity to look at diverse mixtures. It is very common that we'll find mixtures that have 12 species, maybe even more, that are commonly available. However, the research data on these cover crop mixes is not clear. Oftentimes what we see is that in diverse mixtures, we'll see one or two species that will dominate the mix. These species are also more expensive than a 2 to 3 species mix. As we have talked about, in diverse mixes, 1 or 2 of the species will dominate and 3 or 4 more will contribute to yield. If you look at the contribution, typically what we see is that grasses will dominate these mixtures where grasses are included. Grasses are the biomass producers, and they do a nice job of providing a lot of additional growth. The broadleaf plants, which includes the legumes and forbs, these are poor competitors with grasses. So if they're in combination in the mixtures with the grasses, we'll often see the grasses outcompete the legumes and forb contribution that's in the mixtures. The available resources that we have, we've got one dedicated specifically to managing hail damaged crops. That's the UNL Hail No website. That website is mentioned at the top of the list. There are also a series of 3 NEB guides that provide some information, although it's not specific to hail damaged crops. There are some information in each of these NEB guides that is useful as we look to planting a lot of these annual crops following a hail event. planting guidelines for annual forages that can be found at the beef.unl.edu website. And then the last two on the list, the annual cool season forages for late fall and early spring double crop, and also summer annual forages, are both NEB guides that can be found on the extensionpublications.unl.edu website. All three of these NEB guides, as I indicated, will provide additional information to help you guide your selection on managing some cover crops after a hail event. The forage options, when we get to that point that we're looking at selecting a forage crop or a crop to plant after a hail event, the first question we have to ask is, what do we really want to accomplish with selecting a particular forage? Okay, we use the term cover crop and we use the term forage cover crop. Oftentimes we use those to mean the same thing. The big difference is that these species are similar. Oftentimes they're the same species. They do have similar agronomic management, but the difference is that the end use of these crops is often the characteristic that dictates whether or not they are a forage crop or a cover crop. There's still some risk involved with planting these cover crops after a hail event. Typically during the establishment process and the planting date, we do have more control over that situation, so the timing of planting is one that's important, and we do have a lot of control over that particular risk. After planting, there are the typical production risks that still exist. These are risks that we have less control over. These are the environmental risks, such as drought after planting. Then we also have early freeze or late freeze events that can also dictate some of the production capability of these cover crops after a hail event. And then finally, there's oftentimes some increased management and additional skill set that needs to be developed as we try to manage a lot of these cover crops into a hailed out crop, because typically what we're trying to do is establish a crop into something that has a very heavy residue remaining. So the forage options are there a pretty lengthy list of them there, but I think if we break these down into a list of cool season species and we bring them down into a list of warm season species, that helps narrow our list a little bit. As we indicated earlier, the grasses tend to be the biomass producers, and so those should be the important ones that we consider. For the cool season species, more or less we're talking about the winter annual small grains. Oats, cereal rye, triticale, wheat, and barley are the most common ones. Brassicas also can be used, and we'll talk about those toward the end of this presentation, but brassicas can also be an important contributor to these cover crop mixtures. When we look at the warm season species, the summer annuals that we're all familiar with, such as Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, and also the forage sorghums, are the most likely candidates that will be planted following these hail events as corn is beginning to tassel. Pearl millet is also an option, as is the German or foxtail millet. There are also numerous other summer crops that we can include in these mixtures, such as sunflower, cowpea, mung bean, and also sun hemp. Planting date is an important consideration when we're establishing forage cover crops after a hail event. This photograph demonstrates very well the differences in planting date that we see. The two brassicas on the left of the photograph and the two brassicas on the right of the photograph were both harvested on October 16th. The two brassicas that are on the left were planted on September 5th, which was about 10 days later than the two brassicas on the right, which were planted on August 25th. So a difference of 10 days in planting really has a lot of difference in the biomass yield. Grasses growth shows the same effects as the brassicas, although the brassicas tend to show it a little bit better because they do have the root there that enhances the growth. The importance of planting date, especially as we're dealing with a lot of cover crops, I've broken these down into some different times of planting. Planting dates of cover crops on hail events that occur before August 1st. Summer annuals are going to be the best option, okay? At this point, cool seasons are risky, although oats and some other spring species may have some capability to produce some growth with a shorter growing season. If we look at the month of August, so the dates between August 1st and September 1st, this is kind of a transition as we move from the summer annuals over to the cool seasons. During this time period, cool season annuals are likely going to be the best choice. Warm season annuals may have some success with a longer growing season, especially if they can be planted in the first half of August. So to simplify that a little bit, I would say between August 1st and August 15th, I would focus more on the warm season annuals as my primary choice. And if we move to the second half of August, the cool season annuals are likely going to be the best choice. After September 1st, summer annuals are not recommended at this point. The cool season annuals are going to be the best choice. However, there still may be some risk with the spring species running into a short growing season and not quite providing the biomass production that we would like. It might be best after September 1st to plant a mix of spring cool season species in combination with something that's winter hardy, such as the cereal rye. After October 1, warm seasons are out of the question at this point. Winter annuals are the best bet. Winter annuals are actually the only choice at this point. Those spring annuals, the spring species such that oats, are going to be very risky choices because the growing season is likely to be short enough that they're not going to have appreciable growth at this point. So after October 1, we're looking at some cool season species that have some level of winter hardiness so that they can be planted, provide a little bit of additional growth that will serve as cover over the fall and early winter, and then they can accumulate some biomass in the spring and begin growth at that point. Key points again, it's very important before you do anything that you communicate with your crop insurance agent. Secondarily, it's also important that you know your herbicide program so that you can make some eliminate some species that may not be allowed on the herbicide label. Determine your goals for planting a cover crop, and then only then can you go in and make a wise cover crop choice. Take-home messages again for July plantings. This would be the ones that would be prior to August 1. Our warm seasons at this point, those are the ones that stand the best chance of success for producing adequate forage yield. Adding a cool season species may provide additional growth later in the season, or they may be outcompeted with the warm season species if they're included in a mixture. One of the things that I would caution you against, though, is do not lower the warm season grass seeding rate to increase the cool season growth later in the season. If you do that, you're not taking advantage of the environmental conditions that are available for that warm season growth, and so you're reducing the potential of the warm season production to favor the cool seasons. If it's necessary to plant a cover crop mixture to meet program compliance, including something that's inexpensive such as a brassica, rapeseed would be a very good choice. That combination would be the least costly trade-off. And then finally, when we talk about planting cover crops, the two agronomic issues that are important when considering forage cover crops following hail-damaged corn or soybean are planting date is most important, and then during the early tasseling to the early flowering, especially the early tasseling in the corn, there's still the potential that high soil residual N is still present. So these cover crops planted in a timely manner to reduce the potential for leaching is something that's also important. And finally, just to reiterate this, a lot of the information that we have is not related to specific scenarios as we talk about what to plant as a cover crop following hail damaged corn or soybean. The best information that we have is our Hail No project. And again, that can be found at cropwatch.unl.edu/Hail No. As you look at this website, I'd like to take note that there is a survey link at the top of each page. And if you look at this, please take a few minutes to go ahead and answer that survey. That feedback is going to be very important as we try to move forward with this project and develop some information that's going to be more specific to these different timing of these hail events.